If you were to take everything that is quote-unquote meta about Stellaris and put it all into a single empire, you'd probably end up with something like this, the Slaver Technocracy. Greetings everyone, I'm Stefan, and today we'll start our coverage of very powerful and possibly very broken empire builds in Stellaris. This is of course the first example because it is by far one of the most overpowered ones, and even with prosperity education, you're going to be able to dominate anyone in sight. Now, I'm going to take you guys through the empire build. I'll explain everything about it and why we have chosen the specific traits, civics, and ethics. And of course, I'll take you guys through the strategy of this build and through some gameplay so that you guys can see how to dominate with it and deal with any problems that could potentially come up. So let's begin with the government coverage. Obviously, the crux of this build is the civic setup, being technocracy and slaver guilds, and in fact, that is what characterizes this build. You see, these two civics are among the most powerful in the game. In my civics tier list, I've ranked technocracy as S tier and slaver guilds as A tier. Any of these civics by themselves will be very powerful, but when combined, they are a very, very nasty combo. You see, technocracy will boost your scientists very significantly by adding some unity production to every single one. This means that you don't really have to worry about unity production throughout your empire, and you'll be able to tech rush while also having a very sizable amount of unity production alongside it. You of course also get extra research on your planets from science director jobs, so in the end, your science and unity production are both increased dramatically. Slaver guilds is going to add to that. You see, with the newly introduced Indentured Servitude slavery type, you can actually have some of your slaves work as specialists. This means that your slaves can be working the hyper-efficient technocracy jobs while also consuming virtually no upkeep and also being more productive than regular pops. We'll be doing a demonstration of how that works in-game, but keep in mind that this is what the build is all about. Specialist slaves are incredibly powerful, and when combined with technocracy, you get a very, very powerful tech rush. Now, the ethics and authority are relatively simple. We are of course going with authoritarian and materialist, which by themselves are very solid ethics, but this specific ethic setup is required for this sort of civic setup. By themselves, authoritarian and materialist are probably two of the strongest ethics trees, so having this requirement isn't actually that bad. Along with authoritarian, you get the stratified economy living standard, which is by far the best living standard because it allows you to pay virtually nothing for your workers and slaves, and also gives those two pop types virtually no diplomatic power. That means that those pops will not really impact your stability on your planets, and your slaves can be as unhappy as you want them to be, while also having virtually no impact on your economy. Fanatic Materialist, on the other hand, is also quite incredible. The 10% research speed is equivalent to a whole Ascension perk, and the robot upkeep reduction is going to be very handy later on when you decide to synthetically ascend, because of course, you will want to synthetically ascend with this Empire build. Now as for authority, you actually have a bit of a choice. You could, instead of going dictatorial, go with oligarchic. Oligarchic offers you more options early on, and you will be able to reroll your leader every 20 years instead of every time your leader dies. However, what I propose is to go for dictatorial at the very start, and then later on, once you get your third civic slot, actually reform to oligarchic so that you can get meritocracy as your third civic. This way, you can save influence early on when it is most important, and also go for oligarchic, which is slightly more optimal as long as you have more influence to play with. With this government build in mind, let's take a quick look at the traits of this empire. As far as the negative traits are concerned, this is pretty much as optimal as you can get. Deviants will not really have much of an impact on your empire, although with the current rework of governing ethics, it might have a little bit more of an impact than it would in 2.5 or in previous versions. Now, Unruly, on the other hand, is a free pick. It's basically free. You see, for the 2 trade points, you will have to build an extra bureaucrat every 200 pops. Unruly is by far the best negative trait in the game, and once I do more builds, you're going to see that come up more and more often. As far as the positive options go, you have a bit more flexibility. You see, intelligent and natural engineers are pretty much required for this build. You will of course want to boost your research as much as possible, since you are of course playing a technocracy, and engineering is by far the best technology tree, so you want to boost your research in that. Although if you really prefer the physics tree, you can go for natural physicists or something like that. Although I don't really see the merit in that. Instead, we'll be going with the most optimal option and going with engineers. Rapid breeders, on the other hand, is something that you only want to choose if you're fine with amenities. You see, with this build, you will have a bit more of an amenities issue than with other empires, because one of your administrator pops will actually get replaced with a science director. Science directors produce slightly less amenities than administrators, and so overall you're going to have a bit more of a problem with amenities than any normal empire. If you're feeling like those problems are very significant, you can of course swap rapid breeders for charismatic, but since I'll be giving some tips on amenities issues throughout this video, I think rapid breeders is by far the best choice. With the traits out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the origins, and here you also have a bit of a choice. Of course, for this particular build and for this particular video, I'll be going with prosperous unification. But if you wanted to boost the power of this empire even further, you could be going with something like Shattered Ring, Void Dwellers, and Scion. Of course, all three are limited to the Federation's DLC, and most of the time they're not available in multiplayer, so I generally want to avoid those until we have a very interesting build that I can show off for you guys later. Today, however, we'll be going with Prosperous Unification, which is probably the best option besides all those three. That is because Prosperous Unification will give you a massive head start in terms of pops and districts, and it will also give you a massive modifier on your home planet for extra amenities and resource production. This means that your capital can be building and producing way more stuff, and in fact, the extra pops will unlock an extra building slot on your capital, meaning that you can fit an extra research lab on that planet and be a bit further ahead than everyone else. Now that we've covered the entirety of the Empire setup, let's take a look at how this Empire is going to function. Now, I have mentioned that we're going for a tech rush. Of course, the tech rush is one of two very optimal strategies to be using in any Stellaris game, the other one being an early rush of another empire. Since our empire is optimized for technology rush rather than a physical fleet rush, we're going to be going for a strategy that involves turtling in the early game and an aggressive assault about 60 or further years down the line. You see, with the massive amounts of technology that you can produce with this empire, you're going to be far ahead of everyone in techs, and while everyone is rocking destroyers, you'll be able to rock cruisers. In fact, cruisers may be the best time for you to go out and attack, because early cruisers with strikecraft completely wipe out any destroyers and corvettes, and you'll be able to just dominate anything in sight. If you cannot go to war by the time you get cruisers, you can of course wait around until you get battleships, because battleships will just wipe out cruisers and anything else that comes alongside it. If you're interested in how to build those very powerful ships, you can check out the link in the top right corner, and I have a full ship design guide available for you guys. Besides the big overarching strat of technology rushing and attacking later down the line, we're also going to be going for colony rush early on. That means that we're going to be trying to secure as many planets as early as possible and grow our empire that way. By the time we reach year 60 or so, we'll be able to amass a very powerful economy and a very powerful technological base that allows us to strike anyone on sight, and it will be able to dominate anyone that comes our way, even Grand Admiral and Starnet AI. Since we don't want to be raffle stomped by AI early on, we're also going to want to go for a defensive stance as far as expansion and defenses are concerned. We're going to want to go for 2 or 3 or 4 very powerful stations, along with a small, perhaps 700 power fleet by year 15 or so. If you spawn next to someone very aggressive, you might want to prioritize your military techs and use your technological edge to boost your fleet power rather than your economy. Of course, if you spawn normally and have some territory to expand into without meeting any very aggressive boys, you're going to want to just go for the economy techs, and that way you're going to be able to build up your economy, and by a strong economy, you're going to build up your technology, and by a strong technology, you're going to build up your fleet. That is the cycle of the technocracy, and that is why this build is so powerful. But anyways, let's pop into a game and see it in action. As you can see here, we have obviously started with my usual levels of luck, and we only have a single choke point to work with. Let me restart the game for a more normal example. Alrighty, now instead of 1 choke point, we actually have 2 to work with. Excellent. So in this situation, we would expand primarily in the northward direction, claim a choke point here, and also claim a choke point right here. Potentially, if these things converge on a single choke point, we'd want to expand down south, but don't plan on taking too many systems early on. After all, your primary focus is going to be on colonization and developing planets, not taking space that you cannot defend in a war. You will generally want to avoid war early on, and in fact, if you can secure good relations with both your neighbors, you can just demilitarize completely and just go for a straight up tech rush. If you don't have to worry about fleet power, you're going to be able to pump significantly more resources into your economy and grow a lot faster. That is why this sort of build with Scion is so incredibly strong. With Scion, you'll be able to just leave all your defenses to the Fallen Empire and just completely focus on tech rushing. Tech rushing without a fleet will allow you to advance much further in the game than anyone else, but since we're playing in a more or less normal situation, we will want to focus on building some bits of a fleet to defend early on. However, at the very start of the game, you don't really need a fleet, and even if you did, 100 fleet power is simply not enough to do anything. So what we're going to do is go to Ship Designer, strip down all our ships, and that way we're going to be able to upgrade our existing 3 corvettes and get 145 alloys. This is going to be a significant boon to our early economy, and as you can see, we're going to start off with significantly more resources than any other normal empire. This trick has been temporarily patched in 2.6, but has since been reverted to normal, and now you can do this sort of thing once more. Another trick that I like to do in the early game is, of course, do a crime lord deal. So what we're going to do is unemploy our enforcer. That way we're going to produce a little bit more crime on our planet, and then we'll go for a crime lord deal. This is only going to cost us 25 influence and will give us a permanent plus 10 stability. Even if you employ your enforcer once more and go back to having 0 crime, this will never expire and you will forever have plus 10 stability on your planet. With the additional stability and prosperity certification, you're going to be swimming in resources, and compared to someone who doesn't have this sort of start, you're going to be far ahead and will be producing quite a bit more resources than they are. Speaking of resource production, we can now check out the primary method of how this empire dominates anyone else. This is the slave researcher. The slave researcher consumes no additional upkeep. As you can see, they will only consume the 2 upkeep for researcher jobs, and that is because we are living in the stratified economy living standard. If we were to go to decent conditions, slaves would require some upkeep, but even then they would require far less upkeep than specialists normally would. To make sure that our slaves can properly work the specialist jobs, we'll want to make sure that Indentured Servitude is indeed enabled. If you're playing with Charismatic, for example, instead of Rapid Breeders, your default slavery type is going to be Domestic Servitude, and so none of your slaves are going to start in specialist jobs, and even when you do switch to Indentured Servitude, they will not necessarily immediately shift up. In fact, there's no real way of forcing certain pops to shift up and become specialists. As far as I'm aware, only about 40% of your specialists and 40% of your workers actually become enslaved. There's no real way of forcing slaves to go from being miners to being researchers, so you are going to have to deal with some researchers and specialists not being slaves, but honestly, it is not that big of an issue. Your worker pops are still going to be far more efficient as slaves as compared to non-slaves, and whenever you do get slaves to work your metallurgist jobs, for example, they're going to be far more efficient than non-slaves. As you can see here, the slave produces far more resources than the non-slave and also consumes far less consumer goods. In addition to that, slaves also consume less housing and amenities usage. This means that you don't have to worry about housing and amenities as much as you normally would, and overall, it is a very good feature. This will also help you out significantly when colonizing new planets, because of course amenities and housing are big problems on new colonies, at least until you get to 10 pops and can build the upgraded buildings. In fact, part of the strategy will revolve around getting those colonies to 10 pops, and I'll be showing you guys how to develop an efficient colony right now. Alrighty, looks like we have our first colony up and running, and as you can see here, one of the pops on the colony is actually a slave. Even though he is a slave, he does have a very high happiness due to high stability, and due to a bunch of modifiers from our government. It looks like, wow, we get plus 10% happiness from our government, which is certainly very, very lucky. I've traded one very lucky start for another lucky start, and just saying this is not going to be representative of every single one of your starts. But do keep in mind that stability and happiness is going to be relatively high, at least early on, but later on, as you develop your colony towards the 10 pop mark, stability and happiness is actually going to go down quite significantly. The happiness bonuses from high amenities will of course go down, but as long as you keep your stability above 40%, you're going to be more or less good to go. Ideally, most of your pops on developing colonies will be working just manual labor jobs, so you'll want to build plenty of districts on your planets. And of course, if you want, you can resettle pops from your capital in order to speed up the growth of your colony. So here, once we build this new district, we'll be able to resettle a couple pops from our capital, and even though we are at 34 pops, and we could potentially get an extra building slot by getting to 35 pops, we could also help develop our colony and get it up and running a bit faster. Soon enough, we'll be able to get robots as a tech option, and once robots come, we'll want to get the robot assembly plant on every planet. This means resettling pops to get at least 5 pops on every single planet, so that way we can get a robot assembly plant as the first building. Robot assembly plants will help us grow our colonies dramatically, and having that extra 2 growth per planet is very significant. For now though, since we don't have robots as an option, we're going to want to hold off on resettling a bunch of pops on the planet, unless of course you really want to develop your colony, which is the situation right now. I want to, for the sake of demonstration, demonstrate a growing colony. So we're going to resettle a couple pops from our capital planet. So we're going to resettle 2 of these pops, and our stability is going to be noticeably lower. Stability is going to get lower over time as you build more and more districts, and you try to get up to the 10 pop mark. Of course, once you get to the 10 pops and upgrade your building to an administrative building, you're going to be more or less fine because the building will produce some housing and amenities on its own, as well as give you extra jobs that produce more amenities. To help out with amenities on your planets, there's two things you can do. One of them is available early on, which is distribute luxury goods, which is of course applicable on all planets, but it just depends on how big they are. Since you're going to be producing plenty of resources early on, this isn't that big of a deal, and it is well worth the extra amenities. The second option for amenities is to talk to the Artisan Enclave, and with those guys, you'll be able to commission an art piece. This thing will provide plus 15% more amenities on your planet and can really help you out early on. So now that we have more districts up and running, we can resettle more and more pops. Of course, it doesn't really matter what pops you resettle, since eventually they will be shifted around and some of them will become non-slaves and some of them will turn back to being slaves. The game keeps 40% of a planet's population as slaves at any given time, and so now we should maybe see an adjustment once we get to 10 pops, and so once we get this colony up to 10 pops, 4 of them will probably be slaves. Now as you can see here, we are also working on a bit of an archaeological site. If you really want to min-max your game, you can actually go ahead and sell all of the relics, and that way you're going to be able to get significant amounts of energy. That energy can be used to buy alloys, for example. It can be used to buy extra resources to build up your colonies and to build up more buildings. Now, since we don't have any robot assembly plants available yet, the second best option is going to be civilian industries, or if you're really worried about your defense, alloy foundries. Since we are not particularly worried about our neighbors early on, we're going to go for civilian industries, and that way we'll be able to avoid buying up consumer goods later on. Alrighty, now that we have 10 available jobs on this planet, let's resettle enough pops to fill up the planet further. Let's actually resettle from our other colony. That's not going to be that big of an issue. And what we're going to do is upgrade the building. Now as you can see here, amenities went down to 0 on this planet, and if we didn't have this luxurious distributed thing, we would actually be in the negative amenities. Negative amenities is bad territory, and we want to avoid it at all costs. Having low amenities will produce low happiness, and that in turn will produce low stability. Since we want to keep our stability above 40%, we want to avoid negative amenities as much as possible. If your stability does fall below 40% for a very brief period of time, such as the time it takes you to upgrade the building, you can potentially be more or less fine once the building is upgraded, but keep in mind that you really want to avoid that 40% mark. Alrighty, now that the primary building is upgraded on the planet, we now have an administrator and a science director on the planet, and our amenities are back into the positive, and everything is looking good. After this point, you can continue to develop your planets as usual. Of course, you might want to unemploy the enforcer job, at least early on. You don't need the enforcer when you only have 10 pops, and you can instead go ahead and build more buildings. Since we have nearly research robotic workers already, we can hold off on the robot assembly plant and build that as a second building. We will also want to build that as one of the buildings on our capital, and actually, as far as buildings on the capital are concerned, as you can see here, we have 4 research labs, a single alloy foundry, and a single civilian industries. We have completely removed the bureaucratic center because overall it's not contributing too much to our economy and to our research speed. Having an extra research lab instead of the bureaucratic center actually produces more research overall than having the bureaucratic center and not having the extra research lab. If you want to have a bit more fleet power, you will of course want to replace one of these research labs with an alloy foundry, but most times you can actually get away with just building 4 research labs, having a single alloy foundry, and relying on very defensive stations to provide the bulk of your defense. As you can see here, the station with only 1 hangar bay is 1.1k fleet power, and once we finish the second hangar bay, it's going to be roughly 1.6k fleet power. That is a very powerful station, and combined with a small fleet of 700 or so fleet power worth of corvettes, this is going to be able to defend against any sort of invasion from any sort of normal AI. Now, since we have not played this particular empire very optimally, let me load in a save where I have played it optimally and show you the results. As you can see here, the empire is built quite optimally. We have 2 stations, both of which are 1.7k fleet power, and we have a small fleet of 800 fleet power. If any sort of AI declares war on us, we will be able to mobilize our fleet, send it to the station, and with 2.5k combined fleet power, we will be able to defend quite easily against any sort of threats posed by AI. Against an AI with Fanatic Materialist, Distinguished Admiralty, and Warlike, we actually stack up relatively well. Overall, this Empire build is very strong, and if you want to use this build competitively, you're going to have a relatively good time doing so. In future videos, I'll be showing off more Empire builds that are both interesting and powerful, so make sure to subscribe to the channel and stick around for future videos. Anyways, thanks everyone for watching, special thanks to my Patreon supporters, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.